serving the motor coach industry, but also interacting with all sorts of different types of entities. In the last 2 years, Mike has spoken at over 50 state association and national organization conferences as a subject matter expert on the hours of service and electronic logging devices. Overall, though, Mike has significant experience with the motor coach and transportation industry. He's been in the industry for over 33 years, 13 of which were with a motor coach company. He has been instrumental in training and educating the motor coach industry in hours of service and operational efficiencies, not only that fleet telematics bring, but also what ELDs or electronic locking devices are bringing today. He's trained well over 2,000 drivers and administrators in the use of this technology. He has also been in leadership for the groups that help bring compliance education to the masses, being involved with the Bus Industry Safety Council since 2006 and rising up through the ranks to serve as its chair, and now taking a second generation look, helping to educate our maintenance professionals in the industry, serving as the current chair of the Bus Maintenance and Repair Council. With that, I'd like to turn over to Mike McDonal.
Thanks, Brandon. Good day, everyone. Welcome from across the country. Even though you may be doing things within parts of the country that may not be as familiar or as aware of what's going on, we're very glad that RTAP has brought us together today to go over exactly what's going on in our regulatory world. So I kind of changed the title on this a little bit to make it Hours of Service, Fact, Fiction, and the reality and your role within it. So let me just first start by showing you the topics we're going to cover here in the next little while. Next slide, please, Kara. Thanks. We're going to talk about the Hours of Service rules. Then from there, we're going to talk about what the electronic logging device regulation looks like, and then how to become compliant with that. There is a great deal of data that is captured within that regulation, and how do we go about managing that data on a day-to-day basis. And then looking beyond hours of service and electronic logging devices, the other technologies that are being made available through all of the different types of vehicles that we operate in passenger transportation. And then finally, how do we implement those technologies into our fleet to make us safer and more efficient companies for our passengers and all the way to our bottom line. Next. So the hours of service rule. Passenger carriers have been following the same rules since the beginning of driver time record keeping, which was right after World War II. Folks on the property side, on the trucking side, have had several changes within the last decade or so, but we still are under the same regulations as they were nearly 70 years ago. We can drive no more than 10 hours. We can be on duty no more than 15 hours, and they are not consecutive. In our business where we're transporting folks, we may have some downtime throughout our day, and that time when that driver is able to go off duty, that does not count against the time that they're permitted to be on duty and working. Depending on if you're a 6 or a 7-day operation, your drivers can work no more than 60 hours in a 7-day period or 70 hours in an 8-day period, again, depending on how your specific operation works. Still, a driver must have 8 consecutive hours off to reset those 10 and 15-hour clocks. I can tell you from an enforcement point of view, that is probably the strongest part of enforcement that the regulators look at, is not necessarily so much if they're over the 10 or they're over the 15. They're looking very hard to make sure that that driver is getting at least those 8 consecutive hours off. There are some exceptions. Many of them are based on oil field, utilities, and agriculture. We in the passenger carrier segment of transportation have not been afforded many of the exemptions that we have. Although organizations like ABA, like RTAP, and others, I'm sure are looking out for your best interests. And if there are pieces of the regulation that you don't necessarily fit within or feel as though you have those organizations at your disposal to be able to get guidance and how to work with the regulators to possibly see if there would be some type of relief for you in those types of operations. The most common exemption, though, for passenger carriers is those which is called the short haul or the 100 air mile radius exemption. This is a very specific exemption that has several requirements to qualify. Not only do you have to stay within the 100 air mile radius, but you must also be finished your day within 12 consecutive hours, or you can have 2 split shifts that those 2 shifts cumulatively cannot equal 12 hours. The one that gets most people, though, is that you must return to the same place that you started your day. So what that means is if your driver leaves your terminal, and they go out and do a morning commuter run, if they return back to your terminal, they would qualify for that. However, I had a scheduled service operation in my bus business, and many of my drivers would go to a local mall or somewhere close to the origin of their afternoon trip and would not return. So that would nullify that exemption for those drivers for that period. The way that we track hours for drivers using this exemption is that they aren't required to keep a log book, so to speak, but they have to have a time card or a timesheet that would show that the hour that they began work and the hour that they ended work. Next slide. Next slide, Kara.
Yep.
So the ELD regulation. The ELD regulation is 516 pages long. I've had the pleasure of reading it 4 times, and after the 3rd time, it all kind of starts to make sense. It became law and enforceable on December 18th of 2017, so it's just about 3 weeks old. This regulation has bounced back and forth over probably the last 4 or 5 years. But 2 years ago in 2015 is when the final rule came out for this enforcement date to begin a few weeks ago. Most important thing to remember, any driver having to create a record of duty status prior to that date would need to convert to an electronic recording. None of the hours of service rules have changed, just the way that we need to record them is going to be changing. So what that means is if your driver did a logbook prior to December 18th, they need to be now recording that time in an electronic manner, either through an electronic logging device or an automatic onboard recorder. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. The biggest change in the way that we're recording that time is drivers on a paper log would be recording their time in 15-minute increments. Now that we're recording it electronically, that we're recording your driver down to the second. We have found that many drivers are liking the use of electronic logging devices, and many carriers are as well. There are some carriers that run some long routes that are really close to running up against the 10-hour driving time, and many have had to make adjustments to that. Many are finding out what the reality of hours of service are, in that, number one, to make sure their drivers and the carriers have a true understanding of how the hours of service regulations operate, and number two, exactly how long the drivers operate once they leave your yard. There are some drivers that over the years have been, as I like to say, making their logbooks work. Well, what will happen is now that with the electronic logging device, the bus will automatically put the driver onto the driving line when they reach a certain miles per hour. So a driver's driving time will be truly recorded by the bus, and it will not have any opportunity ever for anyone, the driver or anyone at the company, to be able to diminish or reduce any driving time that the driver has. There are very few exceptions that will allow drivers to stay on paper logs. Number one is, of course, if they are still operating under the 100 air mile radius regulation, you can still keep a timesheet as long as they meet all the sub-requirements within that. And the second primary one is if you have a driver that would create a paper log in 8 times or less in a rolling 30-day period, they are still required to keep a record of duty status. It just would not have to be done electronically. Next slide, please, Carol. The hours of service. One of the things that we have to look at is, do you participate in interstate commerce? And there's a lot of folks out there that this is not as cut and dry as some would think. They think that you have to literally cross a state line in order to participate in interstate commerce, and that's not true. As you see there, I have the word intent for interstate commerce. Your piece of the trip may never leave the state in which you operate in, but the intent from the beginning to the end of that trip would be for those people to go from one jurisdiction to another. For example, if you're working feeder service to Greyhound or any other for-hire carriers, even though you may only take the people within your state, if you're connecting them from one transportation source to another that would take them out of state, you are participating in interstate commerce. And again, if you're picking someone up or dropping them off at an airport, a train station, or any type of maritime transportation, again, you are participating in interstate commerce even though you're not leaving your home state. In addition, there are several states looking at intra-state requirements. I know right now the state of Florida, the state of Texas, the state of Oklahoma, the state of Washington, Oregon, and California are looking at implementing electronic logging even for operators who never leave those states. Typically the states that have very large land masses that you can drive many, many hours and never leave the state, you will see that that will happen. States with special requirements. One of the things that I recommend in my 30-plus years in the transportation industry is have a relationship with your local enforcement folks, whether that be your local, your state, and the federal regulatory agencies that reside in your state. Talk to them, be part of them. All of you have a great resource within RTAP, but within each one of your individual states, there's also either a state or a regional association, as well as the American Bus Association, that can help you understand what some special requirements are. I know for one, there's a provision in the state of Minnesota about trips that last within the state versus trips that go out of the state and how they are to be logged. I'm working with some folks in the state of Minnesota now to get a better handle on how that is to be recorded, and we haven't come to a complete conclusion yet, but I would say by the end of next week we'll have our feet firmly on the ground by that. The hours of service, again, is not determined by what license that you hold in your pocket, but in the type of vehicle that you are operating. So one of the changes in the definition of a commercial motor vehicle in recent times has been the addition of a vehicle that is designed to carry 8 passengers or more in a for-hire application. So you don't need to have a big bus to have to record your hours of service. So again, it's not license-based, it's going to be vehicle-based. Next one, Kara. So ELD compliance. There's 3 stages in ELD compliance. The first stage that has been out for many, many years is what they called electronic monitoring. And that's basically where a driver could keep track of their logbook in their cell phone, on their tablet or whatever, and have no connectivity whatsoever to the bus. That phase 1 is what expired on December 17th of last year. So now in phase 2, all drivers must be using an automatic onboard recording device or an electronic logging device that is self-certified by the manufacturers of that device. Now, an AOBRD will be certified, and that technology has been around probably since the early 1990s. The Congress and the FMCSA have furthered the data set that they're extracting from the vehicle and made that into what we now know as ELD. So if you have a phase 2 unit known as an automatic onboard recording device, that is a perfectly legal and reasonable device to use until December of 2019. At the end of 2019, everyone must move into phase 3, the final stage, which is having a true and electronic logging device. An electronic logging device must be connected to the engine and it must minimally record the speed, the number of engine hours, and the engine miles from the electronic control module of the vehicle. That controls a lot of things. Number one, where it has vehicle speed. When a vehicle reaches no more than 5 miles per hour, it will automatically put the driver onto the drive line. So, like I said, drivers may spend time in places looking for a place to park or finding their way to park until their afternoon run or something like that would happen. Some drivers have been known to mark that other than driving time. Well, that won't be able to happen anymore because the vehicle will control that part of the driver's log as to exactly when they are driving. All of this equipment must be installed and be operational, and most importantly, drivers be comfortable with it before the December 18th deadline. So I can tell you there are still quite a few challenges out there. I just came back from an industry event last week, and I was actually standing in the Department of Transportation's booth there talking with them, and there were several bus operators coming up and telling the federal government, I don't have this, what do you recommend? So there's still not only a great learning curve going on out there, but people actually onboarding the technology that's required. Next, Carol. So data management. Depending on the type of device that you have, and depending on how much more than the minimal data that I said, the hours, the miles, and the speed that are required, there's a lot more data that comes from there because we're talking to the engine of your vehicle. So there's a large amount of data that's going to be collected without any additional technology added to it. Most companies are going to have a black box or a connection right to the diagnostic port that a mechanic would use to find out what's going on with your engine. They're going to be pulling all of this data into your company. Some of this data you'll have access to, others you will not, depending on who your provider would be, and also depending on what level of package you may purchase from them. When you add technology, this is only going to increase the data that you manage. So not only would you have engine data, maintenance data, speed data, all of those different kinds of things, as you add technology such as camera systems and other types of safety technology, there's a lot of data that needs to be managed. When you add items that include speed and driver behaviors, these need to be monitored and acted upon. We're recording, as I said, the engine speed so we can put a driver onto the drive line when appropriate, but not only that, we're recording that speed the entire time that driver's operating. So many of you in rural areas have the opportunity of having higher speed limits on some of the highways that you move. Your provider should be able to give you a top-end warning. So if your driver's on a 70-mile-an-hour road or a 75-mile-an-hour road, wherever you want that top-end speed where it is leaving your comfort zone, you can get a notification that says your driver's doing 77 miles an hour, 78 miles an hour. And that type of data you need to be able to react on. Because what's going to happen is if you have something bad occur in your operation and they find that speed could be attributable to the occurrence of that bad incident, they're going to go back and say, well, you already have a black box on all of your buses, provided that they're 1996 or newer. So they're already going to have access to that data. Now you have access to that data if you're using these types of operational systems. And even if you don't have an ELD, these systems can be made available to you as well. But if they find that the driver involved in a crash or a collision has had a speeding history and you've done nothing about it, things can get a lot worse very, very quickly. One of the things that you're going to have to look at as you get increased data about your drivers and your vehicles is you're going to have to go back and review and update your company policies and what your expectations need to be to cover all of your bases. One of the things that I highly recommend is when you review your company policies and your expectations, make sure that it's a company policy that you the creator of that policy can live with. And here's what I mean by that. It's very easy to separate an employee from your company who has not done a good job. Okay, and we have those in our operations, and we work with them and we coach them to try and become better employees, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. But everybody's going to have that top group of drivers that they really enjoy working with. They're always on time. They take good care of the equipment. They take good care of the people. And when one of those drivers that do a great job for us, when they violate that company policy, if you're not able to exercise the same discipline as you would for any other employee, that policy is no good. So when you write that policy, think of that top handful of drivers that if one of those had to come to your office and be coached or reviewed about the policy that they have not complied with, are you able to exercise the same discipline as you would with anyone else? Next slide, Kara. There's a whole lot of available technologies in coming from APTA, the American Public Transit Association meeting late last year in Atlanta, and then again the two large motor coach shows are coming up here, one this past week and one in 2 more weeks. There's just a ton of stuff being brought to us. Some of this has been around for quite some time. Some of this is making its way into our fleet now, and some of it is 5 years ago what we would have thought was pie in the sky, but now it's starting to show up throughout the transportation, the passenger and property transportation industries. So, of course, available technology right out of the gate has been something that's been around for a while, which has been GPS. So we've been tracking our vehicles and things like that for quite some time, and that is kind of what's migrated into the automatic onboard recording device and the electronic logging devices as far as the congressional mandate that has come down about 3 weeks ago. Many transportation systems, especially those in scheduled service and transit, are instituting camera systems for the protection of your driver and your passengers, as well as from a risk management or mitigation standpoint. I put cameras on my fleet of buses probably close to 7 years ago, and I can tell you in the first year they more than paid for themselves in the way that my claims went down, especially when lawyers, I'm here in the Baltimore, Washington area, and it's like every other house is a lawyer. So when lawyers find out that you have video, if they have kind of an iffy case, it tends to go away really quickly. Speed monitors. We have speed monitors now, not only through our GPS system, some of the camera systems have speed built into them as well. And of course, the ELD and AOBRD will have speed built in as well because it's part of the functionality of the technology. Adaptive cruise control is something that you're starting to see come out as standard equipment a few years ago in the higher end automotive field, and it's now starting to come out into the large commercial vehicles as well. I know that Van Hool and a couple of the other European manufacturers are making more and more of this available as optional, and some of it is even becoming more standard equipment. Adaptive cruise control will change if the driver has the vehicle in cruise control and it gets too close to a vehicle, it will slow the bus down without the driver having to make any adjustments by touching the brake or anything like that. Automatic braking devices, 2 or 3 years ago, it was in Volvo and Mercedes, and then I saw over the weekend a commercial that is now in Nissan. So this is where there is a sensor or a group of sensors in the front of the bus, and then when it detects a fixed object within a certain range, it'll apply the brakes automatically for the vehicle. I've been at a couple of the MCI shows this year, and that is another one of the technologies that they're putting on or making available to a lot of the buses. Lane departure technology. Again, you're starting to see this in automotive arenas, but what it does again is it has sensors that are looking at the road, and then when the driver drifts either left or right into another lane, it will get their attention by either a light and or an audio cue. Another one is the height warning and clearance warnings. My company does a lot of work with companies that use double-decker buses. We have set up nationwide where there are low bridge warnings, where approximately 1 mile away from that, they'll get a warning that they're entering a potential clearance issue. We've also worked out some technology that here at Union Station in DC, the double-decker buses don't quite fit. So we have a sensor at the entrance to Union Station that once that bus hits that sensor, our device lowers the bus 4 inches. They go into the parking deck, they board their passengers, and as they leave the parking deck, once they leave, it will again raise the bus 4 inches to its standard road height and clearance. Tire pressure monitoring has been around for quite some time. Tires being one of the 3 major bus fire components or causations, measuring not only the tire pressure, but the tire temperature as well. So it would also give the driver an audible and or a light notification that they may have a potential issue there as well. One of the latest technologies that's come out is engine and maintenance diagnosis. As we all know, that there's a lot of electronics that are in the engines and transmissions of our buses these days, and when we connect into that electronic control module, that's where all of that data is stored and transmitted. So your provider should be able to tell you what those codes are, what they mean, and certain providers have formed partnerships with Cummins and Detroit and a lot of the other engine manufacturers that they can also send you immediately upon that notification a way to diagnose that bus from afar. So your mechanic or your dispatcher would be able to see that, oh, this is, you have the bus is overheating, you're low on coolant. Your driver may be able to correct that on the roadside if they carry spare coolant. Other times it may be a turbocharger, it may be the after treatment in the emissions area, and this will help you and your driver make a better decision if they should continue on the road or whether they should pull over. One of the things that this is going to lead to is predictive versus preventive maintenance. What's going to happen is the bus is going to start telling you that it's sick before you have to bring it in and do your scheduled maintenance on it. We record probably in the neighborhood of 20 to 25,000 different maintenance codes a day over the roughly 20,000 vehicles that we're installed on in the U.S. and Canada. So we can take that information and provide it to you and your maintenance team exactly as what is my number one fault with my bus? What is the number one thing that's coming up that's keeping my bus from operating efficiently? And that would be able to give your company the idea of, do I need to look at that more often? Do I need to look at it? Have I not been looking at it, and do I need to add it to my preventive maintenance? So that's where predictive maintenance is going to come into play here in the very near future, especially as the engine and transmission manufacturers open up additional information for folks outside of the bus to take a look at. Next, Kara. How to implement technology. This is a key part. There is a lot of technology available in the industry today. Number one is do your homework. Number one, find out, what do I need, what do I want, and how am I going to use it? How is it going to impact my business? Find a company or two that you think that can deliver what you're looking for, and ask them for a live demo. And when I say don't just ask for a live demo, don't do a webinar like we are now. Get some devices, put them on your buses, and see how it works for you. Select a company that knows and understands your business. I will tell you that there is a great deal of technology out there that is truck-based, okay? If you look at over-the-road motor coach companies, there's about 4,200 of them in the United States. If you add in the smaller shuttle vehicles and things like that, that takes the entire passenger carrier family that's registered with DOT to about 15 to 18,000 companies. On the trucking side, there's 550,000 companies. So a lot of this technology is truck-based. Make sure that the company that you select or that you want to partner with understands what you do. Your operation in rural transit and in the areas that you service, of course, may be even more different than what the over-the-road bus people do. Make sure that they know and understand your business before you make that partnership for a long haul, because technology changes. We all know that. You know, we've always heard the axiom that, hey, I just bought a new laptop and in 6 months it'll be obsolete. Well, that happens a lot in technology. And as that technology evolves, how is that partnership going to work for you? Are you going to have to spend additional funds to update hardware, software, and things like that? Because anytime that there's going to be an update, there's also going to be an educational curve to all of that as well. Try and limit the number of vendors you have per bus. What will happen is when you try and build a better mousetrap with all of the technology that you have on your vehicles, one of the things that you tend to happen is I got the best price for GPS for this company, and I got the best price for cameras for this company, and I got the best price for an ELD from this company, and I got a best price for a maintenance system from this company. Well, what's going to happen is a lot of those components are all going to be connected to the same data source. So what will happen is when company A's product isn't working correctly, they're going to say, well, that's because company B or company C is blocking this or blocking that. Try and find a vendor that can give you the most opportunity within that relationship. There are quite a few companies out there that do cross over into all of those different types of technologies. Find one that you're comfortable with and work with it. And like I said, partner with them and grow with them. That's probably the best piece of advice that I can give anybody as they enter the technology world in transportation. And most importantly, once you have that selection made, have a point person in your organization to lead the project. I can't tell you how many companies that I've worked with in the past several years that there's one person for this and one person for that, and even worse, there's nobody in charge and there's nobody taking the lead. So you end up purchasing something, you got 100 boxes of stuff out in your garage and nobody knows what to do with it. Make sure that you have a point person in your organization, a project manager, a project leader that will be able to be your liaison with your selected partner. Next, Kara. Involve your entire organization. Technology is going to impact your entire organization. And what do I mean by that? On the over-the-road side, number one, for everybody, it's going to impact your drivers. Your drivers are going to be using all of this technology, and to many of them to their benefit. You know, I like to tell people that ELD doesn't stand for electronic logging device. It stands for easier life for drivers, because once they get accustomed to using an electronic means to do their job and not have to do things manually, it saves them a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of angst that they may have throughout the day. Also, it's going to impact your dispatching folks next. Depending on the type of dispatch that you use now, you may use technology as part of your dispatching process, but there's many integrations that you can use with the other technologies as well. If you're doing work outside of your scheduled service, if you're doing charter work, you're going to have to look at either people in your sales department, or if you are a 100% scheduled service. I know when I ran my scheduled service, the one thing I was always looking for was efficiencies in either doing cross-routing or things like that to be able to use the least number of buses to accomplish the most amount of work. So again, technology can help you manage those aspects of efficiency in your company, as well as being able to see where you might be going over the limit a little bit as well. One of the other parts that of your organization will affect, again, is maintenance. And it's also going to affect your accounting department. And let me tell you what I mean by that. When I put electronics into engine electronics into my fleet in 2013, I saw very quickly how fast my drivers were going and how long they were idling. Over a 2-year period, my fuel savings alone paid for my initial investment, and I was able to also, from data coming from the technology I was using, I was able to put a driver incentive program in place because I could see what each driver was doing individually by their logging in on their vehicle and things like that. So I didn't have to worry about necessarily looking and seeing who was in this bus or anything like that. It's automatically going to be coming to me because I could see that driver in there. So if I saw bus 1702 was speeding, I know who was in 1702, even if it was a different driver every day, because that driver had an identification. I can also tell you it'll affect your maintenance department because my worst idlers in my fleet were my mechanics and my cleaners. So there's efficiencies that can be found all over your operation. Verify your data and implement change. As I said, you're going to have to review your company policies, see where your folks stand within the parameters that you already have set, and then as your people are improving, reward them if that's available in your company. Technology can do a great deal to help you run your missions more effectively and efficiency. And I think that pretty much wraps it up, doesn't it? Oh, okay. So if you are a company that will be required to use an electronic logging device, the first thing you have to do is make sure that they are on the list of approved vendors with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And what that means is there's probably close to 100 of these devices now that a company has built, has tested, and the producer, the manufacturers of these companies have certified that they can do everything that 516-page regulation requires them to do. So if you see the link there at the bottom, csa.fmcsa.dot.gov/ELD/list, if you are someone that is going to be required to use an ELD, please review that list, and that will put you on the right course to start finding that initial provider for you. Remember to keep in mind that even though if you're on a paper log system now, again, our rules aren't changing. You have to do a daily review of these electronics the same way that you would your paper log, okay? Just because they're electronic, there's a lot of things that happen automatically, but you're going to start learning more about your business as you go through. Did the driver go off duty from the night before? What we find is this is the most common mistake that drivers are making out of the chute. Drivers get back at the end of the day, they're tired, they're their lowest point of the day. We find a lot of them forget to log off duty. The regulation says that after 6 minutes, if a driver does not change their duty status, we can never, ever, ever put them off duty. They must claim their own off-duty time. After 6 minutes, we automatically put them on duty, not driving. So if you go off duty at 6 o'clock at night and you come back at 6 o'clock the next morning, you've already got 12 consecutive hours of on-duty time that'll need to be corrected. Did the driver show an adequate amount of time on their pre-trip and post-trip? Since the beginnings on a paper log, we've always been told that it's 15 minutes for a pre-trip and 15 for a post-trip. Now, that's because that's the shortest amount of time that we could show on any paper log. On an electronic log, as you remember, we are measuring time to the second. So if a driver does a 3-minute pre-trip, it's going to show up as a 3-minute pre-trip. If they do a 13-minute pre-trip or a 30-minute pre-trip, that's what's going to be shown on their daily log. The same as with paper logs, a driver can invoke Section 395.1B for adverse conditions, that if a driver encounters an adverse condition, whether it be weather or road conditions, that was unforeseen prior to dispatch of that day, they can still record that in their electronic log, especially if they go into violation. Did the driver use personal conveyance, and if it was used properly? Personal conveyance is one of the most ambiguous parts of the rule. There was just some additional guidance that was put out by FMCSA, and unfortunately it did not address some of the passenger carrier opportunities that we have for a driver to have personal use of a vehicle. It was all more focused on the trucking or property side, and we're still hoping to get some clarification in the next few months on the passenger side. Does the driver have a signature on each 24-hour period? So again, if a driver is doing a paper log or has been doing a paper log in the past, they would, even for their days off, if they would have Saturday and or Sunday off, they would still create a paper log that would show that 24 hours consecutive off duty. They still need to do that on an electronic log, but the one thing that the electronic log will not allow you to do is to predict the future. So if I was going on vacation next week, at my end of the shift today on a paper log, I could turn in my next 7 days on one log as being off duty. Cannot do that on electronics, as it moves literally minute by minute on that. So your driver would have to sign and or approve those logs either at the end of every one of those days off or upon their return to duty. Has the driver approved and recertified any edits made by his or her log by an administrator? Similarly, in the same way that we do paper logs now, an electronic log must be done in the driver's own handwriting, the same that 395.8 says now on a paper log. So when your driver is given a unique code to identify themselves as the user of that electronic log, that becomes their handwriting. Now, when that driver forgets to log off duty at the end of the day, we hope that that driver goes back and fixes their own log, but you may authorize a company official to go in and suggest or recommend a change to that log, which must be approved by the driver before it is changed on the log. So very similarly now, if you have a paper log and then the driver forgets to put the date or their math is wrong on their individual duty statuses, you know, we highlight the paper log or put a sticky note on it and put it back in their mailbox. We're doing it the same way, except their mailbox now is going to be their cell phone, their tablet, or whatever device that they're using to operate the log on the vehicle. And most importantly, were there any hours of service violations, and were they addressed with the driver? You know, as we get through our trips and our routes and we start getting acclimated to these systems, we start to see exactly how long our drivers are operating and are they within the parameters of the hours of service regulations. Next, Carol. Logs will take time to review, but again, they need to be looked at from an external point of view. So what I always try and do is when I look at a log, whether it's paper or whether it's electronic, I always look at it through the eyes of an enforcement officer. Have I assigned all the unassigned driving to a driver or explained why unassigned driving is not attributable to a driver? Anytime that a vehicle is operated where a driver does not identify themselves, it gets put into an account called unassigned driving. So this is time and distance, miles and minutes, that belong on somebody's log that aren't. So we need to review every day that time and distance and who it belongs to so their logs are complete and accurate. Can I explain this to a regulating authority, meaning at the roadside or during a compliance review? Will you be able to explain exactly how this driver's log, why it looks that way? Can I justify an edit to the driver's log as plausible and being legal? One of the things that you'll find is logs are easy to correct and, for lack of a better word, manipulate. However, remember that a driver's log is a legal document and at all times must be as factual as possible. And you must be able to explain any edits or changes that were made either by a company official or by the driver. Because if not, it may be interpreted as a falsification of a log. Falsification of a log is a much more extreme offense than if you had a simple form and manner type of mistake on your log. So if you could see where someone had a willful amendment done to their log that was false, that can be proven, it can be very bad news for that driver and for your company. Can I prove that I took corrective action when I found a problem? Again, if you see that you have a problem with the log and you don't do anything about it, that's part of your corporate safety culture. It's part of the fabric in which your company is doing. Anytime that you get a safety review, whether it be on a roadside or whether it be in-house, it's going to be driven by what are your policies and procedures that you wrote and are you following them? And just remember, folks, any government regulation, whether it's FMCSA, EPA, FTA, any of that is a minimum requirement, a bare minimum. You can have a company policy that can be more stringent, but if you do make it more stringent, you have to follow your policy. Can I show that I'm using the data I received from my fleet management system to make meaningful action? Meaningful action is part 6 of the safety management cycle and the most important part. You review your hiring, your communication, your training, your monitoring, and when I see these things, am I making changes? Am I adapting my policies? Am I talking with my drivers and coaching them? Am I looking at my operation as a whole to make sure that I'm doing everything possible to be operating within the bounds of the law? And finally, did I take immediate action when I was advised of an ELD malfunction? An ELD has a rule that says if a device malfunctions, the driver has to report it, and once the company receives that report, the company has 8 days to either replace or repair that device. Next, Kara. Again, as I started with, you have a great organization here with RTAP and a lot of the other state organizations that you may participate in your general area. As Brandon said when he introduced me, I've been a longtime member of the Bus Industry Safety Council, and we're comprised of a great group of people in security, mechanical safety, operational and maintenance professionals, as well as consultants from all ends of the industry. At our meetings, we typically have government officials from Homeland Security, TSA, the Federal Transit Administration, FMCSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Labor. We go beyond just the nuts and bolts. You know, Department of Labor is in there to talk about OSHA type of operations and workplace safety. The Department of Defense, if you're a carrier that is approved to operate within military installations or moving military personnel. We meet regularly. We meet quarterly via telephone with conference calls, and then we have meetings twice a year in person. Our next one is coming up here in just a few weeks in Charlotte, North Carolina, which we have a great lineup of folks from across the industry and across the regulatory field to keep us up to date. And then our meeting in the summer will be here in the Baltimore area the 3rd week of June. Please visit buses.org. At the top, click on councils, and it will give you the exact meeting agendas and how to register and become a member. And the next one, please, Kara. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about my my home council for the moment, the Bus Maintenance Repair Council. This is one of the newer councils formed by ABA. We're going into our 3rd year to raise the level of awareness and importance of maintenance in the intercity and motor coach operations. It's designed for mechanics, shop supervisors, and other maintenance personnel. We also have government representation from DOT, from the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, which is the group that oversees and regulates the roadside inspection process, and state enforcement partners. Again, we meet with the Bus Industry Safety Council, but one of the things that makes us truly unique is that we do off-site visits on our 2nd day. At our first meeting, we were at Miller Transportation and we visited MCI's facilities in Louisville. For our summer meeting, we visited a Coach USA company and a Cummins repair facility here in the Baltimore area. And we'll be in Charlotte at the same time as BISC, and we will be visiting Trolleys Inc. and Christian Tours there just outside of the Charlotte area, as well as having all of the OEM engine manufacturers and bus builders there to talk about the latest and greatest as far as what's coming out on their buses, and gives them a one-on-one talk with the folks from the factory and the regional folks that they may not have access to ask them questions about issues they're having within their own particular fleets. Kara, I think we got one more. That's it.
Actually, I want to thank you so much, Mike, for such a valuable and informative presentation. It's answered so many questions that people have, but now it's time for more questions, and I see a number of them have come in. So Brandon will facilitate the questions, and we have maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but any questions we don't get to in this time, we will post on our website. So again, thank you, Mike, and ready for questions.
Yeah, let me start with the last one that just came in from Brian Baker. Mike, where can the folks find the list of all the different exemptions? And we're talking 2 different types of exemptions: hours of service exemptions and then ELD exemptions.
Hours of service exemptions, everything hours of service is going to fall under Part 395 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. The regulations are set up in 2 ways. So when you hear me talk about 395.1 or 395.8, that's the actual regulation. Sometimes the exemptions are written within there, but also within the regulatory framework, as I affectionately call it, the gray area, because those pages are gray. They have what they call guidance. And what you'll find is within the guidance, they ask questions similarly to what you're doing now as it pertains to a regulation, and that too can be a second place that an exemption would fall into place. ELD exemptions, that one's pretty cut and dry. For now, and the reason I say that is I just got a notification today that there are 8 more exemptions pending from different industry segments throughout transportation. But if you look at 395.15 through 395 close to 40, which is the ELD piece, that will explain many of the exemptions, especially with ELD. Stay tuned with your local state and national organizations. If you're not a member, join one, because I know I get a daily newsletter every day from ABA telling me what's going on. I also get updates from the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance and how they're going to be interpreting laws. Right now with ELD compliance, they are not putting anyone out of service. They are not rating anyone a citation that will go against your safety score. But there are at least 11 states that are issuing financial penalties for not having an ELD on board.
And I would add to that at least as of right now, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's website, particularly their ELD webpage, actually has a link that's a direct link to all the ELD exemptions. But like Mike said, the hours of service ones, you'll have to look in the overall Federal Motor Carrier Safety standards, regulations to look at those. Mike, can you just real quickly, because I think we've got probably 4 or 5 different questions on the same kind of similar topic. Can you go through the different nexuses that can kind of connect you to interstate commerce and probably having these rules applied to you?
Absolutely. Again, it all goes by intent. Whether you cross a state line or not, it's all going to be where do your people start and where do they end, no matter on how many different types of transportation media that they use to get there. So, for example, if I go to, if I'm in Florida and I go to Port Canaveral and I pick somebody, I take somebody to a cruise ship at Port Canaveral, I just participated in Interstate Commerce because that person's that I delivered there, their ultimate destination is somewhere other than Florida. Okay, so that boat leaves Port Canaveral and goes north, and they get to New York City. When they get to New York City, another bus company picks them up, takes them on a tour of Manhattan, never leaves the state of New York, takes them back to the boat. That company who just provided that tour participated in interstate commerce. Okay? That boat leaves New York and goes to Boston. When they get to Boston, the bus goes to the boat, takes them from a boat to the train. And then they're going to take the train up through New England and see the fall foliage or whatever, and then they take an airplane back home to Florida. So every bus, the boat, the train, and the plane, all of those different transportation providers all participated in interstate commerce, whether they left a single jurisdiction or not.
Okay, great. We're at time, and before people start to leave, I do want to send a big note of thanks to Mike McDonal, our presenter, Brandon Buchanan, our facilitator, as well as the American Bus Association and the two committees you heard about, the Bus Maintenance and Repair Council and the Bus Industry and Safety Council. It's been really great to partner with you on this. A very important topic. And do you have, I don't know if anybody wants to stay on for one or two more questions. Do you want to do one more before?
Yeah, if we could do two more. I mean, there's two more that were kind of in the queue that I definitely wanted to make sure that Mike answered for everyone.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Mike,
so
can you
feel
talk
free to, if you need to leave at 3, but otherwise we'll be doing 2 more questions.
Mike, can you talk a little bit about the technical limitations of the ELD? Like, are there vehicles of a certain age that it's not required to be installed on?
Yes, in the regulation it says any vehicle older than year 2000 is not required to have an ELD. Reason being is that's around the break point that all of this engine data that you've heard me talking about became available on buses. Some buses as far as back as 1996 can transmit that data, but FMCSA chose the year 2000 to be its break point to be sure that all of the data that they're requiring would be available.
And then are you aware, I know this is a topic that, since you and I work so closely together, that we're looking to address with the Busmark group, but are you aware of this technology being installed on cutaways?
Absolutely. I have my devices installed on everything from a Chevy Volt electric car all the way up to a 81 passenger double decker van hole and everything in between.
And I guess the kind of last thing, which hopefully will tie everything together, is what exactly is expected of the driver once you have an ELD installed?
Well, let's take a look at that from one or two different points of view. Number one, from a company point of view, I want that driver to have a workable knowledge of knowing what the impacts are of him using that. You know, for many, many years, you know, especially in the Northeast, we would run trips from DC to New York, and it was very, very tight getting into that 10-hour frame sometimes, depending on weather and traffic patterns. And we found out exactly, you know, going to electronics, what that driver was physically doing that day. The driver is expected to be honest and just keep up with their time. You know, the clock is going to move across their log, so to speak, and we basically want them to be able to just tell us what you're doing when you're doing it, and it's literally by pressing a button. From a roadside, you have to be a little bit more careful. I can tell you that ELD is new to everybody, so not just the driver, but it's also new to the roadside inspectors, where your driver is learning one system on how to operate it. As I said, there's over 100 certified devices. So all of these roadside inspectors are learning up to 100 different ways to review and interpret data. So what I would say is the drivers are expected to be able to speak knowledgeably about the operation of the vehicle and the way that they use the ELD within the vehicle.
Okay. Wonderful. That was a lot of questions to go through in a short amount of time. If you have any additional questions, please contact us and we will put you in touch with the answers. Again, thanks to the American Bus Association, Mike McDonal, Brandon Buchanan, and you, our audience. So we have a number of upcoming webinars this month, and next month we always have different ones. So please check our website and our social media and our e-news, and we hope to see you again.